And a big loss for the international community. Zbigniew Brzezinski, former White House National Security Advisor, has died at the age of 89. Brzezinski had a long career on the international and diplomatic stage. Brzezinski was born in Poland in 1928, and in the late 1930s his family moved to Montreal, Canada, after receiving his undergraduate degree. Brzezinski earned a PhD at Harvard. He was a prolific writer, author of more than 30 books. Brzezinski served as former U.S. President Jimmy Carter's National Security Advisor after helping Carter claim the White House in 1976. He was influential also in bringing Egypt and Israel to the negotiating table for the 1978 Camp David Accords, but his time in the White House was also characterized by infighting with other cabinet members. In 1980, Brzezinski sided with the U.S. Pentagon in a failed mission to rescue U.S. hostages held in Iran. 8 U.S. servicemen died, and the U.S. reputation was badly tarnished. Perhaps the greatest of Brzezinski's greatest international achievements, however, was working to help fully normalize relations between the U.S. and China, a relationship he followed closely for the next 37 years. And with that, CGTN's Sean Calebs tells us more.
Zbigniew Brzezinski's place in history is secure. Intellectual, author, and perhaps best known for working to fully normalize relations between the U.S. and China in 1979. Brzezinski says the two greatest international leaders he dealt with were Pope John Paul II and former Chinese leader Deng Xiaoping.
Deng Xiaoping realized that China was beginning to stagnate economically. And he had the good sense to realize that a breakthrough in the relationship with the United States would make it possible to unleash the productive forces of Chinese society.
U.S. President Richard Nixon and his Secretary of State Henry Kissinger initially opened the door to U.S.-China cooperation. In many ways, Brzezinski worked to escape Kissinger's shadow. Brzezinski says back in the late 70s, he had high hopes for China and the U.S. But in a 2014 interview with CGTN, he said serious competition with the then Soviet Union defined the framework.
What was important at that instance was that the normalization of relations with China and the intensifying and increasingly cordial dialogue with the Chinese leaders made possible rather significant cooperation.
In the decades following, China enjoyed exponential economic growth. Brzezinski had a reputation for staying intellectually razor-sharp, closely following the relationship he worked hard to foster. Brzezinski had praise for Chinese President Xi Jinping and his efforts to curtail corruption in China and at the same time growing the nation's middle class, working to implement what the former White House National Security Advisor called reforms on a monumental scale.
It's very hard to reform a country in which there are 1,300,000,000 people. And the risk, of course, is that it will spin out of control and not be a reform, but produce massive, destructive upheaval.
Brzezinski also told CGTN he supported U.S. President Barack Obama's controversial Asian pivot, but the name alone fueled what he called grievances and suspicions between the U.S. and China.
Which gave the impression that our real realignment regarding the Far East is, first of all, military. And implicit in that, at least to the Chinese, so it seemed, was the notion that means we'll be containing the Chinese.
For decades, the man who worked to establish normal relations between the U.S. and China stayed focused on the ups and downs of the complex ties. In the years before his death, Brzezinski said he remained convinced that despite the occasional mutual unpleasantness, that the two nations had more issues in common than concerns that divided them. Sean Calebs, CGTN in Washington.